All right, how you doing, you bunch of Pharisees? And we know who the Pharisees are. They're the people coming to learn about the law, which is good. The Pharisees needed to learn about the law, the real law, how to actually use the law. That's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. On your handouts, you'll notice I've got an outline on one side. That is basically a slightly modified version of one of my instructors teaching on the law. If you guys are ever looking for good books that are good expositions of the 1689 and kind of walk through each chapter, the ones I use, this was done by the president of Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary, which is where I went, by Sam Waldron. This one is definitely academic. So if you're ever thinking about becoming a student or you know somebody who is one, this is a great book to use. That's the outline I'm going to use because it's the law. We're going to be going through it very basically. So I wanted to use a little bit more of an academic and just kind of run through it real quick. If you want a little bit more practical one, this one is great. Rob Ventura, one of the best kind of Reformed particular type Baptists out there, he's the general editor of this one. This one was done by multiple authors. So basically a bunch of guys just took turns doing each chapter. This one has got much more practical application in it and is a little bit easier to read. So this one's just called The New Exposition of the London Baptist Confession. Dr. Waldron's, I think, is just called A Modern Exposition of the 1689. So they're both great. Like I said, I use one more for academic study. One's a little bit better for practical use. It sounds weird when you say we're going to do the law and I want to use more of an academic one. The reason why we're doing it is because there's whole classes that are taught on the law. You can minor in the law in seminary, so we've got an hour. So we're going to be going through things much more basic, and we're only going to go through the first 4 paragraphs. Paragraphs 5, 6, and 7 are a little bit more of a kind of a broader, almost a reiteration of what was going on in the first 4 chapters. So we're going to focus, or the first 4 paragraphs, so we're going to focus on just those. One more, I know it seems like I'm hawking books right now, but one more thing that just came out recently. This is from Founders Ministries. So it is actually the modern version of the 1689. It also has Keach's Catechism in it. So if you're looking for good family worship material, it also has the Orthodox Catechism in it by Hercules Collins. When it comes to particular Baptist names from the 16th or 17th century, that's my favorite name. As a matter of fact, I've asked Shauna if we ever have another boy, can we name him Hercules Collins? She hasn't agreed yet. Keep telling her to submit, and she's just not getting it, but no. But yeah, great resources to have there, and it's in one nice little small book great for family worship studies and things like that. So but that's usually where I do a lot of my studying out of, is things like this. So when it comes to the law, there's some big questions. You'll notice on the backside, there's where your things are to fill out. We're just going to do some definitions and some very basic questions. I'm going to start first, before I even get into my notes on each paragraph, we're going to start with some very basic definitions. Because the law is difficult to study. It can be very hard, and people get divided over the law. So we're going to be looking at a very practical use of the law. Who would say, just by show of hands, not looking at right or wrong answers, who would say that we are supposed to follow the law perfectly? That's what we're attempting to do. We're going to attempt to follow the law here, even now in the new covenant. The law. We're going to get into that. I know, it's a hard question to answer, isn't it? So we just get to arbitrarily decide which ones we follow and which ones we don't? Really? Did he? Does it say that somewhere? We'll get into it. We are. But then there's also, those aren't the only 2 laws. And we're going to get into, are the 10 Commandments actually laws? Or are they just kind of a dumbed-down version of everything that we're supposed to follow? Maybe you said, hey, you guys are so thick, I'm going to just put 10 things on stone tablets. Try to keep that straight. And in a way, we're going to get into it. That's exactly what the 10 Commandments are. So yeah, we'll get into the divisions. The first vocabulary word that we have, Torah. Somebody throw it out there real quick. Who can give me a definition of the Torah? Part of the Old Testament, not the whole Old Testament. First 5 books, the books of Moses, books of the law. That's actually what Torah means. It just means law. Next one. Oh, sorry, John's adjusting. I'm sorry, I have ADD brain. I move around a lot, so. We don't have the self-tracking cameras in here. It's the best invention for me teaching stuff. All right, Decalogue. Very academic term, but you will hear this if you start to study the law. Anybody know what that term means? Take a stab at it. Anybody know Greek at all? None of our South Peoria Baptist Christian Academy kids are in here. They would have all already spit that one out. Deca in Greek means 10. Means 10. Log comes from the same word as logos or logi, meaning the word. So it literally translates into 10 words. All right, so now what is the Decalogue? The 10 Commandments. But it refers to just slightly more than just the 10 Commandments, and we'll get into that a little bit more. There's the definition up there. The Decalogue is kind of the bridge of what we typically call the moral law. So you have the 10 Commandments, and then you have the moral law. The moral law is everything that the 10 Commandments teaches, not just the 10 exact phrases. Okay? So it's everything that encompasses those 10 Commandments is either referred to as the Decalogue or more commonly referred to as the moral law. So that's the first division of law that we're going to talk about, the moral law. Then we have, next, ceremonial law. What is ceremonial law? Anybody got like a quick definition they could think of? Ceremonial law. Sacrifices would be part of it. Ceremonial law basically incorporated everything of how they worship. Everything that was, how do we give honor to God? How do we as a community express God? There were certain laws, lots of them. If you go through, Exodus and Deuteronomy especially, you'll see multiple chapters dedicated to just these laws. So those are the ceremonial laws. Those are the best places to find them. Everybody's favorite book, Leviticus. And to Kevin's point earlier, there's going to be a lot of references to Hebrews, because that's where we get a lot of our modern uses of the law, how we use the law, how they either were fulfilled, not fulfilled. Is there still moral obligations to some of them? Is there still principled learning on some of them? Most of that can be found in the book of Hebrews. So we've got the Decalogue or the moral law, we've got ceremonial law, and then we've got next the civil law. We should be able to define that one pretty easily. Somebody name me a civil law that you find in the Bible. Find a civil law. Anybody think of one? Yeah, there you go. And that goes back to the 10 Commandments too, doesn't it? Can't murder somebody. But the civil law defined the punishment. Exactly how this is to be adjudicated and what the punishment would be if you are found guilty. So that is the civil law. So threefold division of the law. We have the moral law, the ceremonial law, and the civil law. All right, next slide. Okay, so these are just the topics that I want us to consider to keep in your head as we're doing this. Are the 10 Commandments all there is to the moral law? Do we or do we not follow the ceremonial laws? Why or why not? Do the civil laws only apply to ancient Israel? That's probably, when it comes to the law, the biggest topic that we run into in theological studies. And the reason why that's important in theological studies is because it will affect how you preach. A lot of these things that seem like high theology, the reason why they're important to pastors is because what do you do when you start to preach a certain section and you need to teach that principle? So a lot of people are like, I don't know why theologians debate these things back and forth. This is why. Because it's going to emphasize how we preach. If I believe that the entire law is abolished completely, and I only have to follow the 10 Commandments, I'm going to have a hard time teaching through Romans. I'm going to have a real hard time teaching through Romans. Because it doesn't seem like that's what Paul's saying in Romans, right? However, if I think we've got to follow everything to the letter as it says, I'm going to have a hard time preaching through Hebrews. So we do have to discuss these things. It may not apply to the average Christian, but how would it apply to you guys? How would studying some of the law actually apply to you? Absolutely. So that last point that we have on there, is this important to our Christian witness? Yes. It will be important in your evangelism. It will be important in apologetics. And I'm going to play a little video at the end that shows why. And then I'm going to go through my notes real quick. We're going to do some discussion time towards the end where I'm going to give you a civil law. And we're going to talk about it and whether or not we should still follow the civil law or whether or not it applies or doesn't apply. And those type of things, believe it or not, you go to talk to some of the more smart aleck non-believers, they know enough where they'll point things out like this. They're like, oh yeah, you do that? Do you still wear mixed fibers? When was the last time you sacrificed a goat? They'll point out these things. And what the problem is so many Christians go, well, that's in the Old Testament. And that's their answer. Oh, so we don't believe anything in the Old Testament anymore. Wouldn't Christ prophesy in the Old Testament? So how can you believe the New Testament then? We'll find ourselves in some sticky situations if we don't understand the divisions of the law and our use of the law. So we're going to talk about one specific civil law that I think, it's the one that I always use as an example because I just think it's the easiest to kind of see and wrap your head around and bring into modern day application. So, all right, let's start with paragraph 1. It says, God gave Adam a law of comprehensive obedience written in his heart and a specific precept not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. By these, God obligated him and all his descendants to personal, total, exact, and perpetual obedience. God promised life if Adam fulfilled it and threatened death if he broke it, and he gave Adam the power and ability to keep it. Have any of you ever thought about this? We get to the Old Testament, and there's a lot of stuff. Numerous years go by, lots of years. Then we get the Ten Commandments. We don't get that till much later after Adam and Eve. Much, much, much later. So what law were they going by all those years, centuries? What law were they going by? What this is describing is that law. This is what we say, the law was written on their hearts. So that's why we say the Ten Commandments are not all there is to the moral law. Because God would have given everything that encompasses his morality, his perfection, his justice, and that's a lot more than just 10 things. So what was written on Adam's heart was all of God's morality, all of his sense of justice, all of his fullness was written on Adam's heart and still is today. And we're going to point out why that's still the case today. But basically that first paragraph is saying he had all of the laws of God written on his heart with one negative law. Don't eat the fruit. That was the one negative law. But he had all of God's moral law written on his heart at the same time. So the original dispensation of the law of God. Basically, paragraph takes us to before Moses, takes us to before Sinai, and before the entrance of sin. That's why there's only one negative law. We see a bunch of other negative laws after sin has entered the world. So it was a lot of, this is what I am, do this, and then after sin enters the world, it's like, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. You see a lot more negative laws that come as a consequence of sin. So the law was presented from the beginning because Adam was created as a moral creature who lived under the authority of his creator. We talked about that when we did the chapter on free will. So the paragraph describes the law as it was originally given to Adam. Sentence 1 basically lists the substance of the law. God gave Adam a law of comprehensive obedience, right? These are all the positive things that show obedience towards me. So that's sometimes also referred to maybe as universal law. I'm just throwing out some of these definitions that are all kind of the same because people will use different ones. So the confession first says that God gave Adam a law of universal obedience written in his heart. This was the moral law that God impressed upon Adam's nature. So the moral law is not just the Ten Commandments, it was everything written on Adam's heart. So he was created in the image of God with truth and knowledge of God's moral will. Again, also sometimes called the universal law. The law was written on Adam's heart, and it was not different in substance from the moral law later summarized in the Ten Commandments. And that's an important thing to understand. Because think about it this way. We know it's a summary because we get thou shalt not murder, right? But then Jesus comes along and he tells you, if you have hate for a brother in your heart, you have murdered him in your heart. So there's more than just not murdering. This encompasses everything. Sentence 2, or part 2, there's a specific precept along with universal law. God gave Adam one specific command, not to eat from the tree. This was the one, actually that's a positive command. Eating fruit was not inherently evil. The fruit was forbidden because God had specifically commanded Adam not to do it, right? There's nothing specifically wrong with eating fruit from a tree. This was God's test of one thing I'm going to give you. Let's see if you can obey. Well, God already knew that wasn't going to happen. But it's basically like you're telling Adam, let's just see if you can obey even this one thing. And he couldn't. He didn't. So this command tested Adam, tested if Adam would submit to God simply because God had spoken. Adam was not being asked to determine whether God's command seemed reasonable. He was being called to recognize God's right to have a commandment for his creatures. Next sentence after that, so we had the substance of the moral law and then its obligation. The confession says that through this law, God bound Adam and all his posterity, meaning all of his lineage afterwards. So their personal, entire, and exact perpetual obedience. Now, each of those words is important. Personal obedience means that Adam himself had to obey. The entire obedience means he had to obey every command. The exact obedience means his obedience had to conform perfectly to what God said. And then perpetual, meaning he needed to keep that law. So he had to do it. He had to do it entirely. He had to do it exactly. And he had to keep doing it. That's what obedience to the law means. God's law did not merely require Adam to make a good effort. It required complete righteousness. And then sentence 3 shows you the enforcement of the law. It says, God promised life in Adam, fulfilled it, and threatened death if he broke it. This is why in the garden, we'll get into we've already touched a little bit on God's covenant. As we go through these chapters, we'll talk a little bit more about covenant theology. But that's how we know there was already a covenant written in the garden, because there is consequence. There's judicial consequence for breaking a law, but there's also promise for not breaking the law. So there's both negative aspects of if you break it, there's a positive aspect. This is what happens when you fulfill it, right? Those are all the elements of a covenant. So a lot of people will look at the garden and say, well, there was no covenant already. I'm like, well, all the elements of a covenant are there, right? You have a transcendent being. You have people that have to obey it. You have positive and negative aspects of it. And then you also have a continuation of what happens afterwards. And we have that continuation in the garden when we see the euangelion, right? The first gospel written about Christ. How many of you have read Romans, and there's so many parts in there where it's hard to really decipher what Paul is talking about? Well, if you do this in the law, then you're this kind of person. But if you don't do this in this kind of law, then you're that kind of person. But not doing that in the law and knowing that you're not doing that actually then makes you this kind of person. And you're like, Paul, come on, man. I mean, think about it. They didn't even have periods and commas back then. I mean, it makes it easier now when we throw those things in there, but this is hard stuff to understand. This is why I think when we understand the moral law, its obligation, you'll start to see things a little bit different, such as Romans 2:12-5, and the Ten Commandments, right? It says Romans 2:12-5 explains how people who never received the Mosaic law can still be accountable to God. We always have that one friend that says, oh, what about the innocent guy in some tribal village in Africa who's never heard of God? Like, is he still going to hell? Like, well, if that person existed, but there is no innocent person in this world. Why is there no innocent person in this world? Because the law has been written on everybody's heart. Some of you might have heard testimonies of people that grew up in that kind of environment. And there's something dragging them. They don't know what it was. They drug them out of their tribal family that they lived with. And all of a sudden they end up in a big city. And that's where they first get exposed to Christ. We hear about those things. That's God's providence working. But all of those people had something written already on their hearts prior to this. And people always want to say it that way. What about that innocent person? Like, that's where you're messing up right there. No such thing as an innocent person. All of us are born with the law written on our hearts. And many of us will disobey those laws. I'm going to cut some of this short just a little bit. I'm trying to find my area where we get on to, where do I have it in here? Let's talk a little bit about, application to evangelism and apologetics. So because God's law is written on the unbeliever's heart, evangelism and apologetics are never conversations with someone who is truly neutral or completely ignorant of God's moral standards. That's important. I'm going to be actually preaching over that next week. In our next section of 1 Peter, we're going to be talking about apologetics and evangelism. Often, when I talk to an unbeliever, and let's say there's a lot of people that generally claim to be atheists, even though they don't really understand the term. They just know that they don't go to church and they don't believe in anything, so that's what they call themselves. They say they don't believe in anything. What I do like to point out is like, well, if I said you were an atheist, would you accept that term? And they would say, sure. I was like, okay, well, you do understand that atheism means atheistic, meaning no God. In order to say that you do not believe in a God, you would have to say, at least acknowledge, then there is a God. So that kind of defeats the purpose of it, isn't it? Romans even tells us that everybody is aware of God, and those who disobey his law are simply suppressing truth and unrighteousness, right? That speaks again to the moral law written on people's hearts. This is why this is important to evangelism and those type of things. The next paragraph starts to, I think I may have done this next. Go to the next slide, John. Paragraphs 2 through 4. Okay. Paragraphs 2 through 4. Okay. So now we're talking about the moral law. So he's basically kind of reiterating. The first paragraph is just a broad overview of God's law written on their hearts. I'm going to go off my notes because I think I got things mixed up. It says the same law that was written in the heart of man continued to be perfect rule of righteousness after the fall. Then it was delivered by God on Mount Sinai in the 10 Commandments that was written in 2 tablets. The first 4 commandments contain our duty to God, and the other 6 contain our duty to man. How many people knew that? It's not 5 and 5. Almost every time you see it in a movie or depicted in a picture somewhere, it's 5 and 5. That's not how the Bible describes it. It describes it as 4 and 6. So 4 obligations to God, 6 obligations that are to your fellow man. The fact that the second tablet is all of your obligation to fellow man is going to be very important when we start talking about the civil law. Okay, so keep that in mind, that the second tablet, 6 commandments, all your obligation to fellow man. Right. So at Mount Sinai, God did not create morality for the first time. Instead, he repeated the moral law, added ceremonial ordinances to regulate Israel's worship, and gave judicial law to govern Israel as a nation. So again, we have the next, basically 2 through 4, paragraphs 2 through 4 kind of all go together. One describing the moral law, one describing the ceremonial law, one describing the judicial law. So paragraph 2 is just a repetition of the moral law. It drills down a little bit more from paragraph 1. It says, the confession says, the same law that was written in the heart of man continued to be perfect rule of righteousness after the fall. So the 10 Commandments, again, did not make these things sinful. They already were. The moral law was written on man's heart. So in Adam's heart at his creation, in mankind, his consciousness after the fall, and then in written form finally in Mount Sinai. I didn't include the slide, but I'm working on currently something that may turn into a book project eventually. But a lot of us have, and you probably heard me say it a lot, the type of covenant theology that we have. Covenant theology can be very confusing to a lot of people because there's so many different covenants. What I'm attempting to do is, instead of looking at all the administration of a covenant, is just look at the effects of each covenant. Because to me, it's not a coincidence that we had the law written on our hearts, then it's given to us on a stone tablet. What does the New Testament say about our hearts? That they are a heart of stone. And then we are circumcised to again reveal the heart of flesh. To me, that's not a coincidence. That we had it written on our hearts, then he had to write it down on stone tablets. Our hearts in the new covenant are taken from stone back to flesh. And I think if you understand that, when you go back and you read through Romans and you read how many times Paul says the law of this, the law of that, the law of this, you'll understand Romans a lot better. You'll get a little bit more clearer picture of what Paul is actually saying. So, all right, the circumstances of its relation. The moral law was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in the form of the 10 Commandments, written on 2 stone tablets. So we have, let's see who knows them. Number 1, what's number 1 of the 10 Commandments? No other God, right? Worship no other gods. 2, no idols or false worship. Honor God's name. Keep holy the day that was appointed, so the Sabbath day. And then we have our obligation to man. Honor lawful authorities. Protect human life. No murder. Sexual purity. Respect private property. Don't lie. Speak the truth. Don't covet. Reject covetousness. I break them down into a little bit easier modern terms like that because I think a lot of times when we try to repeat the Ten Commandments, we get stuck on the thou shalt nots and the thous and this and the stuff like that. So I'm looking more of the effect of the Ten Commandments, what those things actually are talking about. So then we get paragraph 3. Now here's where we get into the two other subsets of the law that start to confuse people. Paragraph 3 then starts to talk about the ceremonial law. Again, we said ceremonial law basically governed how they worshiped, correct? It was basically everything in their worship. The purpose of the ceremonial law. The confession says that in addition to the moral law, God gave Israel ceremonial law containing typical ordinances. Now, that word typical is not technically the word that we think of as typical. Like when we say something's typical, we mean it's common, right? That is actually short for the more theological term typological. Anybody know what typological or typological means? Okay. Often in the Old Testament, we say that so many things in the Old Testament were a type and a shadow of what is to come in the New Testament. So when they say typological, what they're actually saying is there's everything in the ceremonial laws points to Christ. Everything that we see in those ceremonial laws is a type and shadow of what is coming and being fulfilled and will be fulfilled under Christ. Correct? All right. I just want to kind of get that out of the way because sometimes when we hear that word typical, we have different definitions in our Western mind sometimes. So the word typical, again, means that these ordinances were types and shadows. The ceremonial law includes such things as the priesthood, animal sacrifices, a tabernacle and a temple, how those things are supposed to be, erected and what they're supposed to be look like, decorated as, ceremonial washing, clean and unclean food, certain religious festivals, and offerings of purifications and other rituals like that. These are things that are encompassed in the ceremonial law. These ceremonies serve two principal purposes. First, they regulate Israel's worship, right? They didn't want to just, God just doesn't want them running around worshiping however they want to. That's kind of what they were doing already, and that's how they got in to a mess that they were in where they found themselves in slavery. So it regulates Israel's worship. Second, the ceremonial prefigures Christ. One of my favorite theologians is a guy named James Jordan, and one of my favorite things he's ever said is especially when it comes to the ceremonial laws, if you get to something weird, like that just sounds crazy, stop and think about it and try to prefigure Christ into it. It will help you understand, because you read through Leviticus, there's some really strange ceremonial laws. Like, why can't I eat meat around the hip bone? I don't understand the point. Think about Christ. Where was he stabbed? Stabbed over the side, right above his hip bone. Why can't you boil a kid in his mother's milk? By kid, obviously they didn't mean a human child. They're talking about a goat. Why can't, so you can boil a goat in milk, just not his own mother's milk. Why can't you do that? You think about where Christ was crucified. In Jerusalem, the very lifeblood, the very nurturing, where all the nurturing commands from God, all their ceremonies, all their laws, comes right there from the temple in Jerusalem. And that's where he's killed. Right? Milk is supposed to be nurturing. The mother's milk is supposed to be nurturing. So if you take those ceremonial laws, when you hear that, think about Christ. When you do those, it'll make it much easier to read Leviticus and some of these other books like that. So try that next time you read through those things. So the priests were pointed forward to Christ as the greater high priest. Sacrifices are pointed forward to his death. The tabernacle pictured God's dwelling among his people. The Passover lamb anticipated Christ as the Lamb of God. The Day of Atonement would anticipate the cleansing and reconciliation accomplished by Christ. So just give that a shot. When you look at ceremonial laws, always try to prefigure Christ into those things. I read a great book one time called Reading Backwards, and that was the point of the book, was to, read through the Old Testament, read through the New Testament, and then take that New Testament, go back and read the Old Testament again. Take everything that you now know in the new covenant of Christ, go back and read the Old Testament again. See if it's a little bit easier for you to understand that way. So the ceremonial law did not save anyone by mere performance or ritual. The ceremony was temporary, but the moral truth illustrated through the ceremony remain perpetually valuable. What does that mean? All throughout Baptist history, this has been pretty common fare. Yes, the ceremonial laws were all fulfilled in Christ. We don't sacrifice animals anymore. All those different feasts and festivals, we don't have those anymore. But that last line, the ceremony was temporary, but the moral truths illustrated through the ceremony remain permanently valuable. I'll give you one that I like to use. There's a lot of talk in the Old Testament, especially in the ceremonial sections, about consecration. Consecrate yourself before the Lord, right? What does it mean to consecrate yourself? Cleanse yourself, make yourself fit in appearance, present yourself as worthy. And this was something that they did when they worshiped, right? Now, the priests are told to do this a little bit more than the average person is, but the average Jew would have been told this as well, too. So I had a conversation one time with a homeless guy right across the street here at QT. We just got talking a little bit. He was wanting some food. I gave him something to eat, and we were sitting there talking. And I said, well, I'm an elder right over here across the street in this church. You should come sometime. We'd love to have you. And he goes, I can't do that. I can't go in there. I'm like, why not? He said, well, look at me. He said, I can't. And he was pretty disheveled. He seemed very lucid. He didn't seem like he was on drugs or anything like that. But he was definitely very dirty. He was very disheveled looking. He said, I can't go. I have too much respect for that place to go in there like that. He had the right idea. He really is understanding. So we got to talking a little bit about consecration. I said, okay, you don't have access to brand new clothes right now, do you? Or the money to go get them. And he said, no, I don't. I said, okay. And I explained to him consecration in the Old Testament. I said, the Lord understands where you are right now. He truly does. He sees you. He knows where you're at. Now, if you truly feel, and I'm glad you do, if you truly feel like there's a consecration that's needed, then couldn't you just walk in and go to the bathroom and wash your face? You do have access to a sink. I said, would that clear your conscience, if you did that? He goes, well, I hadn't thought about it that way. I said, yeah. Consecration didn't mean change everything about who you are right now. It meant to set this day apart as different. This Sabbath day in which you worship has to be different. I can't give you a dogmatic dress code. I just can't. Because consecration is about changing yourself that day, to set that day. It's not about changing yourself to make you look different. It's about your outward appearance representing that this day is different. There's something different. So people will ask me, hey, do you have to dress up to go to church? And I say, well, I believe you should be consecrated on that day. But if you're a lawyer who wears a 3-piece suit every day to work, what are you supposed to wear? Right? It's not so much about how you dress. It's about the attitude of your appearance when you get there and why you're doing it a certain way, right? And that's all I explained to this man. If you really feel like you've got that type of respect and you need to look different when you go in there, I think simply washing your hands and face would be all you really needed to clear your conscience of consecration. And he never did end up coming, but it was a nice conversation. And to tell you the truth, up until that point, and this happens to me a lot when I'm talking to people on the street, there are things I think about in practicality as we're talking that I had never thought of until I just got to talking to a specific person. It's because I understand the general principle of the things. So sometimes practical applications come with experience, and come with helping certain people, or just hearing certain people's stories. So the Old Testament's internal distinction, the Old Testament itself demonstrates that ceremonial observances could never replace moral obedience. Think about Samuel. Samuel did say, to obey is better than a sacrifice. We have other verses throughout, Psalm 46 through 8 emphasizes delight to do God's will rather than just meeting the burnt offering requirements. Samuel even says that. Is God happy with your sacrifice or with your obedience? So again, there was nothing bad about eating the fruit in the tree. This was about obedience. There's nothing special about any of these ceremonial laws. There's nothing special about burning certain types of fat or a certain amount of fat or fat from this animal instead of fat from another animal. It's obedience. Can you obey what I've instructed you on? Jeremiah 7:22-23 emphasizes that the heart of the covenant demand was obey my voice. That's what he tells Jeremiah. These people who previously did not worship me will obey my voice. So we're obviously talking much more about obedience than following things to the exact point. Again, the confession talks about the abrogation of the ceremonial law. Abrogation just means the continual use or lack thereof, right? So Christ fulfilled the ceremonial law through his incarnation, his righteous life, suffering, death, resurrection, and priestly ministry. So Kevin was, I was playing around with Kevin when he said that, but yes. Yes, so we would look at those ceremonial laws are abolished through Christ, but we still need to look at the morality of them, the general principle of those things, because God doesn't do things arbitrarily, right? While we may not have to follow that to the exact letter, and it was about obedience, you think God was just making a list of silly laws? Let's see if I can get them to stand on their head and spin. That's not what he's doing. There actually is a point to those laws. So we do need to actually look, why would he have them do it that way? And understand the morality of those things. That's probably the biggest takeaway I can give you, and we're going to get into it a little bit more when it comes to the civil law, because this one seems to be debated a little bit more, because certain things are abolished doesn't mean we don't look at them. Doesn't mean we don't need to truly seek to understand them, right? We do need to at least look at the morality of it. All right, the addition of the judicial law. How am I doing on time? Sweet. I think we're doing good. All right, again, what is the civil law? Hasn't really changed much from today. We still have civil laws, right? And there are laws that govern how you drive when you're on your way home today. There are laws that govern your conduct, like you can't just walk around punching people, right? As much as sometimes we want to in this world we live in. No, you can't walk around doing certain things like that. You still can't steal people's stuff, right? So property disputes, restitution, criminal penalties, accidental death, negligence, treatment of servants, agricultural practices, public safety, court and witnesses, national inheritance, things like that. These are things that governed what we typically refer to as the civil law. All right. This is where now I'll go off my notes a little bit more. What's the next slide, John? I'm trying to remember which one I did. Okay, go ahead and leave it there for a second. If you have your Bibles, turn to Deuteronomy 22:8. When I teach on the civil law, and the reason why I harp a little bit more on the civil law is because this is the one that tends to get debated a little bit more. Hebrews is very clear about ceremonial laws, how those are fulfilled in Christ. What there is a lot of debate on through the Bible are the civil laws that God gave Israel only for Israel? Or do they still apply today? That's the debate. Now, you will hear the word, if you study this in any length at all, you will very quickly run into the term theonomist. Okay? That's where a lot of debate comes in. Am I a theonomist? Am I not a theonomist? Now, I'm actually in disagreement with the school that I went to over this. I use the term theonomist. I do refer to myself as a theonomist. It just means God's law. Now, the confession in paragraph, this will be paragraph 4, uses the term general equity theonomy. Oh, I do have it on there, don't I? General equity theonomy, and that is the term that I use for myself. What's the term general equity mean to you? Oh, I actually have it written down there, don't I? No, I just said, yeah. So all of the Puritans used it, not just Baptists. The Presbyterians used it. Congregationalists used it. I think the Lutherans were the only ones that did not do this. They're actually just total anti-theonomy altogether. So are the Catholics. But all lines of the Puritan Reformation, the Swiss Reformation, they all use this term because the Dutch Reform also used it as well. So all lines. What does the term general equity mean? Somebody just spit it out, shout it out. Basically, it just means a general equivalent of today. And the reason I say general equivalent is because it's not always about looking for one equivalents. But we're looking in principle, in morality, in perpetuity. How would we apply that law today if the law still exists? Right? That's all general equity really means. Okay. The reason why some people don't like the term general equity, because then a lot of people do go around looking for one equivalents. Like we're going to talk about the law of the parapet. Right? That's what we find in Deuteronomy 22. There's the law of the parapet. Okay. Somebody who's got their Bibles open to Deuteronomy? Should be Deuteronomy 22:8. Yeah. Somebody read Deuteronomy 22:8.
When you build your house, you shall make a parapet blood upon your house if anyone should fall from it.
How many of you have a parapet around your roof? Nobody? So are we to say then that the law of the parapet has been abolished? Would it be abolished, or would we still follow that? Because I don't know about you guys. Unless you live in one of the older parts of Sun City, you probably don't have a flat roof. Okay, so you would. Or another example some people would use would be a large building. And usually you got the HVAC system all up there. If you go to a large building, most of them do have a wall that extends up past the top of the building for people to follow. That is actually, though, it highlights the reason why a lot of people don't like the term general equity theonomy. Because that's what most people tend to do. They tend to look for one-for-one equivalence when what we're saying is there's a morality to those laws just like there was the ceremonial laws. So let's put it this way. I walk into Jim's house, and something wrong with his roof. It's leaking. He doesn't tell me about it. And I walk in there, hey, brother, something comes crashing down on my head. Is that Jim's fault still? Is he going to be held accountable for that? Absolutely. That's the morality of the law of the parapet. This is a love thy neighbor command. Okay. All of the civil laws point back to one of those 6 laws that are on that second tablet. Every single one of them all point back to one of those laws. So it's more than the one-for-one equivalent is good, and we do want to use it that way, but there's more to it than that. So the way my school, I tend to stick with historical terms. So I'll still use the term general equity theonomist. That's what I would call myself. My school just tends to go with what's the morality of the law. They just kind of tend to leave it at that, which I get it. And it does explain what we're talking about a little bit better. What is the morality of this? What the point of the law of the parapet is you are in charge of somebody else when they're at your house. You're in charge of their safety. You need to guard that person, right? That's all that is. So are building codes lawful when we look at our civil government today? They are. We can dispute all day long whether or not civil governments make too many of them and change them constantly just so they can get money for new inspections. We can have that debate, but it doesn't take away the fact that building codes would actually be lawful, right? This comes up a lot because throughout Christian history, a lot of Christians have sought to disobey the civil government. And we do actually have a right to, in a way. I think we abuse that. Some Christians do. Romans 13 does tell us to obey the civil governments, right? Romans 13 does tell us to say that. But what does Romans 13 refer to the civil government as? It refers to them as a deacon. They are a deacon to God's church. So it would be plain to me then that the civil government needs to obey God's law. When the civil government is not obeying God's law, that's when we can start to put up a fuss about certain things, right? Matthew 22, we talk about God says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Is that line really about paying your taxes? Does that whole section really have anything to do with paying taxes? Really doesn't. He's just blasting the Pharisees right there. What he's really saying, and I'm going to touch on this next week when I preach, is that he's asking the Pharisees whose image is printed on you. And if God's image is printed on you, give to God's what is God's, and you're not worrying about this over here, right? So it's not really a line about paying your taxes or not paying your taxes. There's a whole lot of other verses we could go to, right? When I say that I want a theonomic government, I'm not saying I want an ecclesiastic government. I don't want the church to run the government. Right? That's the difference. Because a lot of people will blast you on that. Oh, you want a theonomic government, so you think your church should be running the government? I'm like, no, that would be an ecclesiastical government. I want civil leaders that are going to obey God's law. And they're going to take that general principle that they find in those laws, and that's how they're going to govern. That's what I want. That's what all Christians should want. So we shouldn't shy away from politics. If you feel called to that life, you feel called to serve as a deacon that way, by all means, do it. I'll help you. It's not for a particular calling of mine, but I will help you run a campaign if we need to do that. But too many Christians throughout the years have backed off from those things. We've backed off from civil governments. And we see the result of that. I think if we had more Christians involved in civil governments, we probably wouldn't be in some of the mess. It's not that we would ever do it perfectly, so the mess would still be there because we're messy people. I think we'd be in a lot less of a mess. Too much pietism spread, especially throughout the late 1800s to early and mid 1900s. And we thought we had to almost live like Anabaptists, away from everybody else and just try to do our own thing over here. I don't think that's what God calls us to. I don't think there's too many examples in the New Testament. And Paul used the law, didn't he? Didn't he use current civil laws? Sure. They were going to let him go after beating him. And he goes, no, I appeal to Caesar. I'm a Roman citizen. And that's why you shouldn't have beaten me. I want to appeal to Caesar. And those guys had to be like, come on, man. His name is Paul. Who didn't know he was a Roman citizen before? Who beat him? And he used the law against them. So he rightfully used a civil law. That wasn't a part of God's law, but he rightly used a civil law to his advantage. That's how he got to Rome. He was trying to get there anyway. Like, great. I'll get there through your mess up. I appeal to Caesar. We don't shy away from politics. Is it the most important part of your life? No, training your family and right worshiping and being in community with Christ is obviously going to be the most important part, but we are ruled in our day-to-day lives by a government. So we have to understand its reality and don't shy away from it. But that's really, I like to use the law of the parapet just because I think I just think it's one of the easiest examples to see. So we do have parapets still. Again, we have large buildings. That's what a parapet would have commonly looked like. You see on the flat parts right there, where there's just a little bit of a wall. Again, you see those on tall buildings. And yeah, we don't live on our roofs. And I would even say a home with a flat roof may not necessarily need one. Why? Because we don't live on roofs, right? That's not part of our culture. It was part of their culture, though. So a lot of times when we say, are those laws only for Israel? They're not necessarily wrong by saying those laws were only for Israel, because they did apply to their culture and how they lived. But again, we're looking at the moral principle of those things, okay? All right, before we'll get done a little bit early on this one. I have a video to watch. I'll explain it a little bit more. Basically, there was a test involving alcohol that he was trying to get some of his interns to do so they could take care of a patient. This guy didn't want to drink any, okay? He was saying, no, it's against my religious convictions. I don't want to drink. Eventually, House goes, you know what, fine, I actually need a non-drinker for it to be a better test anyway. And so he's like, I'll just let you be the non-drinker. But this guy is still saying, we're doing a fake test. You don't even know if it's going to help the patient. Why are you forcing anybody to drink? He still doesn't want to be a part of this. And he's saying that's part of his religious convictions. So he's trying to hammer him on, like, oh yeah, isn't life sacred? And all life sacred? We're trying to save a life. Why won't you do this test? Then he pulls out Luke 14. I have to look it up. Oh yeah, my memory's pretty good. Luke 14:5, where they were picking heads of grain, or excuse me, this is the part where Jesus heals somebody on the Sabbath, right? Pharisees are getting all upset about him, and he said, which one of you, if you had a child or an ox and it fell into a pit on the Sabbath, would you not pull them out of the pit? Jesus is explaining the moral law, like everything that you've thought about the Sabbath, when it says to rest from work, doesn't mean you don't do anything. It doesn't mean you're just sitting on your hands. Somebody fell in a pit. Go get him. Now, he's trying to hammer him on that. He's kind of using it wrongly, I think, if whoever the writer of the show, because that actually goes against what House is saying, so I don't know who the writers of the show were, but they didn't use it correctly. But there is another episode I remember seeing of House where he was hammering that same guy on some other stuff. I just couldn't find. He was hammering him on mixed fibers, and John brought up, and there was a bunch of examples of this when I Googled it. I guess there was an episode of West Wing where somebody was doing the same thing. And because sometimes as Christians we can't explain the law to people, we look silly. We look bad. We don't have a good answer for them. Next week we're going to be talking about apologetics in the Sunday service. And this is what we do this for. I want everything that we learn here to increase your ability to evangelize and to give a defense of the faith. It's not just so you have some nice head knowledge and you can impress people with, I studied this or I studied that, right? I want us to be able to actually have a better defense of the faith because of what we're studying. And the law can be tricky because you will get some fairly knowledgeable unbelievers that will try to hammer you on some things like this. And I think, so if somebody comes up to you, let's try that out. Now thinking about the law, if you're out sharing the gospel with somebody goes, well, you're not even a real Christian anyway because you're not supposed to wear mixed fibers and you're wearing a polyester shirt right now. And And they think they got you, right? They think that's a smart answer. What would you say back to them now? Just thinking about the laws. First of all, what was the point of not wearing mixed fibers? Anyway, think about that. What's the moral application of that? Again, God doesn't do anything arbitrarily. Why would he not have them wear mixed fibers? What was Israel guilty of a lot that kind of actually led to their exile? What's that? Worshiping other gods, blending other religious worships into their practices, things like that. That's why he told them not to do that. Okay. A lot of those ceremonial laws also set Israel apart from their other people. Right? So he was saying, you are set apart as my people. Don't look like everybody else. Don't mix with everybody else, right? That was the point of mixed fibers, right? And then again, you can go through your Hebrew references and stuff too, and that'll give you an exact reference to those things being fulfilled in Christ. And that would be your answer back to that person. You can do that without the big point of next week's sermon is going to be about not doing this sarcastically, not doing it out of, oh yeah, you think you got me? Watch this, bam, I'm smarter than you are. Trust me. A lot of us that get into evangelism, especially public evangelism, have all done it. We've all been guilty of it. We've all gone through sometimes what we call a cage stage, where we feel like you're so wild, they got to stick you in a cage for a little while until you calm down. We've all been there. Some of us a little worse than others. I don't think I was that bad. That's my own biased opinion. I'd have to talk to people that witnessed it. But my brother he was a little crazy. I had to rescue him a couple times. But we get full of zeal. We'll talk about that next week too. We get full of zeal, but when our zeal is misplaced, sometimes we don't do things correctly. It's good to have zeal. It's good to have passion. But we need to properly define those things. But that's what I want you to do with this type of knowledge. Study on these things. Go through, read some of those law references that are in there, and just start to think about it that way. This is a ceremonial law. How does this prefigure Christ? This is a civil law. What is the morality behind this, and how would that morality still apply today? So you do those things, your understanding of the law, and your reading of the first 5 books of the Old Testament will be much, much easier. Okay. Questions on anything else? Any other specific laws coming to mind that maybe you haven't thought of before? No? Okay. Yeah, perfect. We got 2 minutes left. That means I got time for a 2-minute prayer. Ready? Yeah, let's pray our way out of here. Gracious Heavenly Father, we just thank you for your law. I know sometimes in our heads we get frustrated in our finite thinking, but we trust that everything in that law is exactly the way you prescribed it. And we can find its fulfillment in Christ, and we can see that the moral application that you've given us is for today. Let this lead to better evangelism, a better Christian witness, so that those that we talk to who are currently unbelievers may come to know you. Use us as your means to draw other people in to salvation in your Son. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen.